The offensive launched by the Ukrainian forces in the first week of June annihilated all Russian resistance. As the Ukrainian attacks intensified, the despair of the Russian soldiers grew. The alternatives for Russian soldiers were limited. To survive, they had to make challenging decisions. They would either submit or flee the front line. It is possible to be captured and executed by Russian commanders and other soldiers if you flee the front. Consequently, their best option is to surrender to Ukrainian forces. To date, more than 30,000 Russian soldiers have surrendered to the Russian army, and this figure is growing. In addition, the Russian forces have lost a record number of senior officers, commanders, and generals in the past month. Now we will introduce you to the realities of the bitter conflicts on the Ukrainian front and the true accounts of the Russian soldiers who surrendered. We will witness the magnificence of the Ukrainians through the opportunities provided by the Ukrainian forces to the Russian prisoners, as well as the parallel realities that are so startling that you will not believe your eyes. So let's commence. Anton, a Russian soldier stationed south of Bakhmut, reported that shells and mortars whistled overhead and detonated around us for 3 days. We were jumping like rabbits under the mortars and bombs. Upon the cessation of hostilities, he and his colleague, soldier Slava, fell asleep. Soon after, the sound of a roaring engine and gunfire woke them, and the bombardment blew up the logs covering the trench they were sheltering in. An entire crater existed at the entrance, and then there was silence. It was very peaceful. Slava, who is now in the custody of Ukrainian soldiers, recalls that his companion told him to flee. They raced into a new trench, leaping over craters and bodies mangled by relentless bombardment. They could hear an overhead vehicle and Ukrainian soldiers. Anton possessed a firearm and an explosive. According to him, he heard a click and 2 explosives were launched. The trench's depth shielded them from the detonation. After a brief period of silence, the Ukrainians returned. "I believe this to be the end," says Anton. He believed he would be either executed or tortured mercilessly. "I placed the rifle in single-shot mode and feared I would accidentally discharge myself. However, I was unable," she says, bursting into sobs. A Ukrainian soldier offers him a cigarette as he quietly weeps and fires up. Anton is one of 8 Russian soldiers detained by the Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade, aka Azov Regiment, in a makeshift prison in eastern Ukraine. The men were held in confined cells that lacked natural ventilation and light, but they had access to food, water, and cigarettes before being transferred to Ukrainian intelligence. He spoke with 3 individuals. Ukrainian intelligence rarely had access to pose at this stage of detention in the presence of 2 Ukrainian soldiers. The 3 men described the low morale in their fortifications, the chaos, and how some Russian forces appeared expendable. They did not appear to be speaking under duress. The Ukrainian soldiers' attitude toward the Russian detainees gave them hope for survival and transformation. The kidnappers want Ukrainian soldiers contracted by the Russians to replace them, but they have little hope. The majority of the captured Russians are detainees brought to the front under the command of Stormzy, a Russian Defense Ministry unit that offers prisoners amnesty in exchange for a 6-month deployment in Ukraine. They are not very valuable to the Russian government, says a Ukrainian combatant with the moniker Grandfather, in contrast to the Ukrainian firefighters captured during the conflict last year. He has been accepting Russian prisoners with similar tales for the past 6 months. Hundreds of Ukrainian and Russian prisoners of war have been exchanged since the beginning of the conflict in 2022. The final significant exchange, which occurred in April, was primarily composed of Azov, who fought in the final combat for Mariupol prior to the Russian invasion. The Azov then formed the 3rd Assault Brigade, which was currently engaged in combat in Bakhmut. Anton claims he is currently serving his 3rd prison term in Russia for narcotic possession, having previously been convicted of a similar offense and a robbery. He claims he was promised a spotless record if he volunteered to fight in Ukraine, but he had no idea he would be sent to the front before being deployed. He and Slava received 2 weeks of rudimentary training. We had no morale, said Russian soldier Slava. As pledged, we expected to hold the defensive line. Wagner, PMC, a private military corporation, we were informed, was the party engaged in active hostilities and that we will be stationed in the liberated land as was previously disclosed to us. Wagner mercenaries conquered Bakhmut after a 10-month conflict that cost thousands of lives on both sides. Their commander, Yevgeny Prigozhin, retreated them weeks before his brief rebellion on June 24, which marched on Moscow. Since then, Ukrainian forces have been besieging Russian troops from the north and south in an effort to retake the devastated city. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Slava was already serving a 10-year sentence for drug trafficking. Like Anton, he was assured that if he joined Stormzy, his criminal record would be expunged. Both claim that the only sources of information about the conflict prior to their deployment were Russian state media. The Russian servicemen were captured while hiding together in a foxhole on the ground above them. Ukrainian soldiers engage rows of desiccated trees with their firearms. As they advanced, they threw grenades at the trenches. 2 Russians are questioned by Ukrainian soldiers regarding their rank, position, and documents. The darkness of the subterranean hole was tense to Russian servicemen are in a kneeling position. Anton places his hands on his inclined head and Slava raises his hands behind him. The pair insists repeatedly that they did not fire at the armed Ukrainian soldiers in front of them. They brought us here and then they left, says Slava. Anton adds, "You better kill us," in a foul-mouthed tirade. The Ukrainian soldier demanded, "Who told you we were going to slaughter and kill you?" As the Ukrainians attempted to break through the heavily fortified Russian defensive positions along a 100-kilometer 600-mile front line, numerous casualties resulted from trench warfare. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, stated recently that every kilometer cost lives. Another prisoner, Russian soldier, Sergei, stated that he exclaimed surrender and that 2 hand grenades killed the soldiers in the trench next to him. His commander had long since fled. "I concealed myself in the trenches. Those who attempted to move from one position to another were attacked by machine guns and vehicles," he recalls. When he spotted the Ukrainian soldiers, he retreated in terror and crept between the 2 soldiers before one of them was slain by flying shrapnel. He radioed the Russian artillery to request protection. "Our artillery did not function as expected. Then ours attempted Grad missile launchers, but were unsuccessful. Then I heard approaching Ukrainians. I started shouting, 'We surrender,' and then they threw grenades at us," he says. "I sensed my hand being severed. When asked my identity, I responded that I was Russian and then surrendered. I began to stand up when a second grenade arrived. Within a second, I was able to crawl halfway out of the trench," he says. A grenade killed the Russian soldier behind him, and Sergei felt a laceration in his leg. Later, a Ukrainian soldier describes how challenging it is to hear what Russian soldiers are saying during the armed conflict. Sergei says, "I was lucky. Twice I was not killed by a grenade and surrendered as a prisoner." Soldiers from Ukraine administered first aid and transported him to a field hospital. Sergei's hand and leg were bandaged when he was freed from his confinement by jumping on one leg. Contrary to the others, he is a contract combatant and not a convict. Last year he stated that he served in Kherson when he enlisted. He claims that the military prosecutor threatened him with incarceration for desertion if he did not return to the battlefield after returning home. The young father asserts that his prior military experience did not prepare him for the meat grinder in Bakhmut, as described by both parties. "It differed greatly from what I saw on television. Parallel reality. I felt fear, pain, and disappointment towards my commanders," he explains. The only route to sustenance and water was a 5-kilometer, 3-mile trek through minefields. Anton states that their immediate commander is a prisoner as well. Slava recalls his commanders getting inebriated on their supply of analgesics under the influence of these commanders. According to Slava, he sent soldiers under mortar fire with irrational orders. Their accounts cannot be independently confirmed, but they are consistent with recordings released by Russian conscripts who claim they were sent to the front with little support. The month-old Ukrainian counter-offensive has been delayed by Russian artillery, jets, and long-range precision missiles in addition to heavily fortified trenches. After being exchanged for Ukrainian POWs, Sergei believes that his disabilities will prevent him from future assignments and prison. Slava and Anton are not so confident. In September of last year, Russia increased the maximum prison terms for surrendering voluntarily to 10 years. When asked about potential retaliation upon Anton's return to his residence, he responded, "I don't know. It is difficult to answer this query, but given the history of our nation, similar events have occurred in the past. He desires to return home, organize her life, and reintegrate with her estranged child. He can return to jail instead." Bakhmut, which has borne the brunt of months of intense fighting, asserts that Russian forces have seized possession of the settlement, while Ukraine denies this and continues to fight. Indeed, it is extremely difficult to determine casualties in an ongoing conflict due to the fact that both parties attempt to conceal information and increase the number of enemy deaths. But there is evidence that Ukraine captured dozens of POWs within a week of its summer offensive. Since the commencement of the summer offensive at the beginning of June, the Ukrainian army has reportedly captured between 5 and 10 Russian service members per day in the Donbass and Zaporizhia regions, according to a study. The majority of Russian soldiers surrendered after the Ukrainian infantry burst through their positions. The fact that a total of 70 or more Russian POWs were rounded up over a 7-day period matches the capture rates set in the early days of the conflict, when signs of weakening Russian army morale were significant. Ukrainian forces captured a Russian soldier assigned to the front fortifications near the village of Novogeorgievka in the Zaporizhia region. The captured Russian soldier asserted that neither Russian artillery nor tanks supported his unit during the conflict. Another POW reported that his defensive position was supported by 3 tanks, but only 2 were manned. Several additional POWs reported unit demoralization. Russian POWs made it obvious that they were treated well by the Ukrainian government. Some POWs had visible wounds, but the majority claimed that the wounds were caused by the conflict. Some videos showed RFU medics treating Russian POWs while sporadically shelling the surrounding area. Considering the manner in which the Russian army treated Ukrainian captives of war, we can conclude that Ukraine's treatment of the invaders is so humane that Putin's pressure will not prevail in these lands. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, Ukrainian defenders engaged in combat close to Rostelivka, Jelasnica, Bykovka, Paraskaver, Kazumyaka, and Lesnica. Russian websites have verified fighting near Kazivka and attacks by the Ukrainian military near Bykovka. Kazivka is now the most significant front line in this region. The Ukrainians are nearly ready to assume complete control of this front line in this city. More than 90% of the Russian trenches were obliterated at Khrushchevka. The decisive moment occurred when the Ukrainians destroyed the elite paratrooper elements of the 11th Russian Airborne Brigade. The commander of the Russian elite VDV brigade was removed from command, and the Russian soldiers capitulated after a lengthy battle. Almost the entire elite Russian parachute corps was forced to surrender to the Ukrainian armed forces in Corsica during this stunning offensive operation. Ukrainian forces also managed to eliminate the commander of the 11th Russian Parachute Corps. The officer in command of propaganda among the Russian paratroopers held a high rank as a result of the absence of Lieutenant Colonel Yevgeny Agafonov, codenamed Paris, who was in charge of the Russian paratroopers in Khrushchevka. The Russian forces in the city lacked command and defense strategy. Yevgeny Agafonov, a Russian lieutenant colonel in command of propaganda, was frequently seen in Zvolker videos. He had reported that little was known about the lieutenant colonel's mortality in the Russian armed forces. All that is known about Agafonov is that Ukrainian forces actively counterattacked and breached Russian defenses on the 21st of June. Ukrainian forces recently executed the Russian lieutenant colonel in Stavka. As previously stated, the Russian elite paratroopers in Stavka were ultimately forced to surrender to the Ukrainian armed forces due to the fact that their commander had left the battlefield at Kaliska. The Russians were rendered powerless by the Ukrainian defense forces who cut off the flanks. The offensive operations of the 72nd Russian Motorized Brigade, which counterattacked to support the Russian elite paratroopers, also failed, since these two Russian units held their final defensive fortifications in Khrushchevka. Russia's situation in the city became extremely precarious. The 11th Russian Airborne Brigade established the basis of the defensive trenches in Kazivka. Now, the Ukrainian armed forces have completely devastated these foundations. After a brief time, we see the Russians in Kleshchev waving a completely white flag after the Ukrainian offensive operation at Kazivka. What is the current state of the Eastern Front with the exile of the Wagner Group's leader to Belarus? Russia's military reinforcements on Ukraine's eastern front lines were severely depleted in order to support Russia during this crucial moment. Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov's soldiers assumed responsibility in Bakhmut and along the city's perimeter. However, the Ukrainian armed forces typically neutralize Kadyrov's forces before they reach the eastern front lines in the Donetsk region. This is due to the fact that Ukrainians control the routes utilized by Chechen soldiers fighting for the Russian army. Typically, military convoys transport Chechen forces to the Donetsk region from Mariupol. In this crucial corridor where Ukrainian forces controlled the strategic connection nodes, Chechen forces are either forced to retreat before they can reach Donetsk or are annihilated by Ukrainian forces. How, then, will Russia exit this crisis? Analysts believe that Vladimir Putin's standing has been undermined by Yevgeny Prigozhin's rebellion during the Ukraine conflict. Since he ordered his troops to go to the neighboring Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin has confronted the largest revolt, which has had a significant impact on him already. Prigozhin frequently criticized the Russian military leadership, asserting that their incompetence had resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of soldiers. Prigozhin also competed against Shoigu and Gerasimov, enhancing the reputation of Wagner by capturing Severodonetsk, Lazivka, and Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. Following the May invasion of Bakhmut, the Russian Defense Ministry substituted the Wagner mercenaries with regular sailors and paratroopers. Shoigu announced on June 10 that all voluntary formations must sign military contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense by July 1. According to Prigozhin, this will not occur, according to former U.S. Army Colonel Seth Numrick. The Russian Ministry of Defense was compelled to act because he was attempting to assimilate Wagner, and once he was captured, he realized he had nothing after their withdrawal from Bakhmut. Wagner forces were either redeployed to Krasnodar in Russia or dispersed behind the front lines in Donetsk and Luhansk, eastern Ukraine. At 5 o'clock local time on June 24, Foot showed Prigozhin's forces launching indiscriminate attacks from the occupied regional military headquarters in Rostov-on-Don. This location was not only the headquarters of the 58th United Arms Army, which was operating in Ukraine at the time, but also the command center for all Russian forces on Ukrainian soil. Geographical footage from the same dates revealed that Wagner's forces crossed the administrative frontier of the Voronezh region, where Russian forces surrendered. This extraordinary uprising was put down and the Wagner Group failed to reach its objective in terms of both politics and authority. However, Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, endured severe damage during this process. Numerous international intelligence sources assert that after the Wagner rebellion, there were dissenting voices in the Moscow administration against Putin, and that these voices will continue to cause future difficulties for the Russian leader. While the Russian army sends its soldiers to perish as cannon fodder, The Ukrainian army attempts to keep its soldiers alive and defend the right to life of Russians. In this regard, the Ukrainian government provides excellent opportunities for Russian personnel. Russian soldiers fleeing the front lines allege that their commanders subjected them to violence from these moments of desperation. The Russian soldiers, believing they had discovered a solution, began searching for the Ukrainian armed forces. "I want to live" surrender line. "I want to live" is based on the provisions of the Geneva Convention that Kiev applies to surrendering Russian soldiers. "I want to live." The capitulation line of the Ukrainian armed forces has received calls from more than 300,000 Russian soldiers expressing their desire to surrender. So what is the typical surrender procedure? The Russians who wish to surrender are instructed to wave a white cloth, remove the magazines from their weapons, aim the barrels down, and remove their body armor and helmets. "I want to live." Officials and Ukrainian armed forces personnel working on this issue ensure that if Russian soldiers want to be sent home in a prisoner exchange, their documents will indicate that they were captured, not that they surrendered voluntarily. Aspiring Russians were encouraged to maintain contact with a non-smartphone button burner phone after establishing contact with their own phones. Thus, surrendering Russian soldiers were untraceable as they were guided by a Ukrainian operator and in some cases a drone. Ruslan Anistin was being pursued by Ukrainian drones armed with small explosives. He crawled up and down a narrow trench for hours. On May 9th, as the sun began to set, he observed a small machine whirring above uneaten parched. Exhausted and alone, crossed his arms above his head and clasped his hands, pleading into the camera of the drone to halt the bombardment. A few miles away near the eastern city of Bakhmut, a command post of Ukraine's 92nd Mechanized Brigade displayed his image on a screen. Colonel Pavlo Fedosenko conferred with other officers before issuing an order to the drone pilots via radio. According to Anton's experience, Russian morale appeared to be deteriorating prior to the recent Ukrainian counteroffensive. Since September, a Ukrainian hotline for Russians who wish to surrender has received over 30,000 inquiries. According to Ukrainian officials, social media posts depict draftees pleading for more equipment and their wives back home, complaining that despite being promised employment in the rear, they are poorly equipped and under heavy bombardment at the front. President Vladimir Putin of Russia stated on Tuesday that Moscow had thus far been able to withstand Ukraine's counteroffensive, but that a significant number of tanks had been lost. Anton is one of the few Russian soldiers to offer to surrender voluntarily to a drone. Anton, a 30-year-old man with a receding hairline and a slight build, studied to become a veterinarian and never expected to find himself in the midst of a conflict. On February 24, 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine, he was a marshal at Penal Colony No. 3, a prison near his birthplace of Idritsa. His social media posts at the time, which included images of the Russian flag and remarks like "Let's punish the fascists," indicated that he supported the war. In a recent interview, he stated that a tattoo on his hand reading "Shavior" for the airborne forces was a reminder of the year of mandatory military service he completed nearly a decade ago. He presumed that only the professional army would fight in Ukraine. "It appeared that we would never be involved," he said on a Sunday after his shift concluded. He reported receiving a call to report to his local draft office. Officials informed him that they were proceeding alphabetically through the names. One instructed him to go home, gather his belongings, and report the following morning, or face jail time for evasion. The next morning, before dawn, Anton departed his home when he told his wife he had been drafted. She wept. So he said his goodbyes the night before and did not wake her or their 3-year-old daughter before he departed. "I didn't see the point," he said. The commanders informed the troops that they would remain in Russia to reinforce the border. Within a month, the shipment of Anton to Ukraine was completed. His unit conducted guard duties and constructed fortified positions in the eastern Ukrainian region of Luhansk, which Russia seized in part in 2014. According to him, there was no conflict for months. This altered early in May. His platoon commander stated that they were proceeding to Bakhmut to provide cover for retreating assault teams. Yevgeny Prigozhin, founder of Wagner Group, had just threatened to withdraw his men after they sustained tens of thousands of casualties in their drive to capture the city at night, and stated, "We understood that they wanted to throw us into that meat grinder." The following evening, he rode a military vehicle to a wooded area a few hundred yards behind the front line. His commander selected him, along with two other recruits, including Anita's acquaintance, the 21-year-old restaurant worker Dmitry Ivanov. Anita stated that they were instructed to advance into the trench system closest to the Ukrainian lines, take cover, and hold their positions. The men carried 4 meals and 6 liters of water in total. At 1 a.m., a Wagner fighter led them to the nearest trench where they were promptly subjected to 14 minutes of mortar fire. The Wagner pilot warned them, "If you refuse to carry out a mission, you will be executed, and if you attempt to retreat, you will be slain as well." During a brief lull in the bombardment, Anita and the others dashed to the next trench. It was difficult to locate refuge from the shelling, only yards from Ukrainian positions. The men stumbled through the darkness, stumbling over discarded bags, weapons, and as dawn broke, dozens of lifeless bodies. They lacked freshness. "They were probably there for a couple of weeks," said Anita. Eventually, he and Ivanov discovered cavities in the trench's walls. They entered the building for protection. Small 4-rotor drones manufactured in China and used to film wedding panoramas posed a constant threat. They transmitted live video that corrected Ukrainian artillery targeting. Some were equipped with modified claws that delivered explosive rounds originally designed for rocket-propelled grenade launchers directly into the trench. At approximately 7 a.m., an explosion injured Ivanov and Anita in the cranium, chest, and shoulder, and Eaton located a walkie-talkie and radioed for assistance. No response. They had also not been given an evacuation location. A few hours later, when Ivanov ran by, he was crouching inside a burrow. Ivanov's lower back was pierced with shrapnel by a detonation. He yelled to Anita that he had lost sensation in his legs. Moments later, he was struck by a third detonation. "I'm not feeling well, brother," Eaton recalled him, saying the Ukrainian drone pilots had been observing the actions of the horrified Russians the entire time. Anita has changed positions. Ivanov removed the fuse from a hand grenade and detonated it beside his head. The third member of their party was severely injured, according to the Ukrainians. He later shot himself with his own gun. Anita was by himself. Drone and mortar attacks persisted throughout the afternoon. By 5 p.m., he was completely exhausted. "I thought I would end up staying in that trench forever," he said. He then had the notion to surrender to the drone. He stood without his weapon and signaled with his hands to cease the attack. His plea to the Ukrainians not to murder him if he surrendered is captured on drone-recorded video of him drawing a finger across his neck and shaking his head. He stated that he lacked a concrete plan, but believed it was worth a try. A few hundred feet away, in another set of trenches, the Ukrainian drone pilots were suspicious, suspecting a trap, as they later recalled. The pilots observed Anita's body language and utilized the drones to respond up and down for affirmative, left and right for negative. Using a series of hand gestures, he proposed that the drones would shine a light, once for affirmative and twice for negative responses. Anita was uncertain of whether or not he would be comprehended. When the drone began to move away, he was relieved and decided to follow it, he said. Since March, Ukrainian drone pilots have been operating in the region. They observed that the Wagner forces commanding the combat moved swiftly and hit adroitly. According to the pilots, regular Russian army recruits were slower and moved in groups, making them simpler to eliminate. The pilots had spent the entire day using drones to murder dozens of Russians with small grenades. According to its pilot, a 26-year-old Ukrainian with the call sign Boxer, an assault drone had already been dispatched to assassinate Anitin. After viewing the high-definition images of Anita and imploring for his life, Boxer aborted his mission and threw the grenade outside of his position. Despite the fact that he is an enemy and has murdered our boys, I still feel sorry for him, he said at the command post. Ukrainian officers instructed Boxer to make contact. He took a Sharpie from his medical kit and wrote in Russian on food ration packaging, "Surrender. Follow the drone." He then filled the packaging with soil to give it weight. The drone flew a 4-minute trajectory before dropping the note for Anita, who scaled the trench wall to retrieve it. Then he realized this was for Rayal. They expressed their desire and I demonstrated my agreement, he stated. The drones observed a night and entered no man's land. He traversed over abandoned rifles, grenades and helmets, as well as severed limbs and decaying corpses. He was strolling like a zombie. A Tuareg designated 2nd Lieutenant of the 92nd Brigade's Achilles drone company stated he was walking on top of his fallen comrades, Achilles, and another drone unit known as Code 9.2 took turns guiding Anitan along a winding path through numerous trenches to minimize danger, flying for 30 minutes at a time before swapping out their batteries. The Russian soldier occasionally peered up at them for reassurance that he would not be harmed. He frequently stopped to drink from a bottle on the ground, consume a cigarette, or simply rest. When he reached the end of one trench, he walked along a main road and stopped next to an inoperable armored personnel carrier. A subsequent detonation occurred on the opposite side of the vehicle. It appeared that Russian artillery was targeting him when Ukrainian trenches came into view. He raised his hands in the air and continued down the road. Confronted by two opposing armies, he sought refuge in artillery craters, mortars shook the earth, and bullets flew through the air explosion. Shrapnel brought down one of the drones. Anathan could see a Ukrainian position surrounded by barbed wire. He fled while avoiding a Russian mortar. He got on his knees and removed his helmet and flak jacket so as not to frighten the Ukrainians. Two soldiers directed their rifles at him as he hurriedly approached a trench. They pinned him to the ground, handcuffed him, and loaded him into a Humvee vehicle. Less than a week later, advancing Ukrainian forces seized the trench where Anton's ordeal commenced. By then, he was sharing a cell with 3 other captured recruits at a detention facility in the Kharkiv region on May 19. He spoke with the journal there in the presence of a security guard. The only decoration on the lime green walls was a poster with instructions for using one of 4 phones. The director of the facility stated that prisoners of war could correspond with their families through the Red Cross. Anton stated that he had not attempted to contact his family. His daughter too arned for the day before he was taken into custody.